My name is Sally Saratt. I currently live in Washington, D.C. and am the senior co-pastor of Calvary Baptist Church. I grew up in South Carolina, in the upstate of South Carolina. Went to college in East Tennessee. So actually went from a not really big town to even smaller town, a dry county where I went to college. But there was a place where actually I was encouraged to imagine being able to love God with my mind and it not just be an emotional thing. And so it just sort of opened a whole new world for me. From my time in college, I spent 2 years in New York doing social ministry programs with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And so I was living in Washington Heights and working in the Hell's Kitchen area, the back street of the Port Authority bus terminal. And met people from all over the world, after school programs, ESL classes, a whole range of things. To say that my world exploded and opened up and turned upside down and right side up again is an understatement. And my 2 years there still continues to shape life. And so I originally thought that at that point in time I might head to seminary, and I realized that I need some time and space maybe to make a more circuitous journey, to make room for myself and gather some experiences, etc. So I actually ended up going to business school instead. I went to the University of Virginia and lived in Charlottesville for a couple of years. So the events of Charlottesville in these last days certainly feel close, right? And then spent my summer at P&G and went to Cincinnati during the summer, and then went back and lived there. It's hard to believe now, but it was only 5 years. But it was a wonderful 5 years. I think I learned a lot of things along the way about like confidence and learning to trust self and various other pieces. I think it was ironic that in a lot of ways my faith journey sort of took off while I was in business school, of all places, as I was stretched and challenged, and who I was and how I was that person in the world started to come together in ways that hadn't yet made sense for me up to that point. I ended up leaving P&G to move back to Greenville, South Carolina, in part because I wanted to be closer to sort of family and support network at that point in time, and was single and had community in Cincinnati, but it felt partial, I guess, if you will. It's like needing to have people that you call whenever, you know. And there, a lot of things happened. One, it's where I started more seriously considering the call, the journey back towards ministry. Very soon after, also met my wife, Maria. And that was a absolutely beautiful journey, and a slow one too, because there were stories that we grew up with about whether or not you could be a person of faith and a person who loves someone of the same gender. And so there's much more to all of that as well. But she finished up divinity school and moved to Greenville, South Carolina. So was there up until we came here to DC 2.5 years ago. And during that time was when I went to do my graduate theological studies down at Emory, at Candler, and spent time as a mental health chaplain, a behavioral health chaplain in a hospital, and various other things. Worked with a Unitarian congregation there for a time, focusing on pastoral care. And it was a beautiful gift to me too, as a place where I was celebrated as a person and minister and one who shared life with my wife. So all of those things like kind of have collected themselves to like allow me to sit here in this place now, serving this community and congregation alongside Maria, and seeing how we might reclaim, find some grounded space for, live into, like, the good that Christianity has often struggled to actually live into and pursue in its history. So it's a daily challenge and invitation, and but it's a beautiful community, and it's wonderful to be here in this time and place.
What is your concept of a higher power or God? And what words do you use?
Yeah. I think most simply, well, this is a tough question, right? To find good words to be able to articulate it, but a fundamental oneness to all that is. You know, Paul Tillich, I think, is the one that uses the ground of being. We recently met an artist in Puerto Rico. His name is Samuel Lind. And he has this image called Madre Tierra. It's of Mother Earth. And it's this Taino woman, like indigenous woman from Puerto Rico. And like the whole of being is in her like womb and in her body, like roots and water, like all of life. And so I recently described that in my sermon this past Sunday as an image of this deep, like oneness or abiding spirit. So I don't think, to say it differently, I don't see God as a white man in the sky that's looking to bless or zap you, but rather profound presence, wisdom. Maybe Sophia is another good word. Start there at least.
So tell me about some of the most important spiritual experiences in your life.
In truth, like the summer when I met Maria, like the whole thing, like that summer was a spiritual experience, like quite poignantly so. Like I could literally go back and walk through it moment by moment, and like there's this very this moment in the midst of that summer. At that time I was almost 33, had been single, had been living alone as an adult for quite some time. And I remember driving, and I had sort of started to realize that this was something more profound than anything else I'd ever experienced. And I remember this moment driving along where it felt like a question of like, Sally, if love actually shows up in a sort of a package or in a person other than what you expected, would you really actually like walk away from it? Would you reject it because it wasn't somehow acceptable? And felt like a holy question. Now it took 1.5 years to answer it, I think. After that, in some ways, it took us a while to figure out how to walk towards life together, especially Marie was already pursuing vocation in a religious field, and I was headed that way, and had been for some time. I think other religious experiences, I think I am a big fan of Howard Thurman's work. And I had the chance to take a course on him at Emory with Luther Smith, who is like one of the leading scholars. Since he was retiring my final semester at Emory, but he did his dissertation on Thurman and then taught courses on Thurman for the rest of his life, and spent time with Thurman in the midst of doing his dissertation and everything else. And I name that just because I think in many ways that whole class and being introduced to Thurman as sort of a conversation partner for my own life was in some ways like a religious experience. I know that sounds a little bit odd to describe it as such. But this particular moment, my professor walked in and read this letter that was published in the Atlanta newspaper during like the civil rights movement, and it was like this absolutely horrific op-ed piece that somebody had written to the journal, with like spewing hatred of black people, just absolutely ridiculously toxic. And then him like sort of drawing up on the board to it, like, where are the boundaries? Where are the limits of who you think is part of God's creation? And then comparing that in some ways to what Thurman, that Thurman was never, ever willing to say that anybody was outside the bounds of oneness, of whom God might be able to imagine to love, etc. I can feel myself exactly where I was sitting kind of in that moment, like kind of trying to take it all in, because I'm like, nope, I'm drawing the line, that's it, I'm going to have to exclude that, and then be like, well, yeah. I think even as challenging as it is, like, to draw a boundary where anyone is beyond, like, that edge of love, of experience, of transformation, of whatever you might call it, like, yeah.
Is there a spiritual story connected to sexuality?
So it wasn't until I got to New York, I talked about my 2 years there as a pretty transformational time, about whether I could, it was like the first place that I could imagine the possibility of being a person of faith and a person who loved someone of the same gender. It was like the first place I had seen it, the first place I had seen queer people in church, period. And a church that was like, this is good, you're wonderful, you're the beloved of God. That was back in 1996. So it's been a while ago now too. So I think sometimes I say that one of the reasons my own sort of vocational journey has made such a big, very big circuitous route is that I needed to have some time to make room for myself. And so, I think if I were to describe faith or my experience of God or all of that, it's almost like one that has just kept expanding. And in that expansion, I found room for myself too. So I would say, my own experience of in particular, it was really and truly encounter with Maria that made it very clear to me that yes, this is love. I've never experienced it before, but I don't at least for me, don't know how I would have arrived on that just like cognitively to know, to be able to say like, I'm gay. Now I get that that's not the same as other people's story, but that's my own story. In a lot of ways, it's almost like the whole, so this whole circuitous journey sort of came together at once. In that, like, I knew love. I had a far more profound sense of my own, like, calling. Like, I don't even think that. So now I'm in sort of professional vocational ministry, but I think that longing, that vocation, like that calling, if you will, towards people, towards questions of faith, what that journey, accessing wisdom, like all the different words you'd use for it. I think those things were happening kind of at the same time, and then it just all started to come together. And it was like, these things don't make sense. They don't fit together. I don't know how, to live into all of it, to the fullness of myself. And yet, it was, you get pricked alive by love too, right? Pricked open. One of the very first things Maria ever declared to me even is like, you have a pastor's heart. So it was like this being seen and known in the fullness of self, which I think is part of what the whole point of faith and religious experience, like to this, to be fully human, to encounter other as fully human, and all that is as part of that.
Tell me about a time you doubted your faith.
Yeah, so a person I haven't talked about is, I have a mentor from college who I still keep up with. I literally talked to him yesterday. His name is Ross Brummett, and was just like really invested in my development as a person of faith, but just as a person. And so, as I did many times during challenging places, just talked to him very honestly about what it felt like. And college had kind of been a time where I'd really engaged in this notion of loving God with my mind, but it just felt like it all was really disconnected. And he actually encouraged me to read the Psalms. As you may know, the psalmists are this place in the Bible where the full range of human emotion and experiences is just really laid out there. And it's not just a sunny version of faith, like a good huge portion of them are psalms of lament and despair and various other things. And just, so what if you just let those be your prayers for a while and just take off some of the pressure and just sort of see where it takes you. Because I think sometimes with our faith, we think it has to only be the sunny parts, or we only bring the, I think that Barbara Brown Taylor wrote a book about learning to walk in the dark, but she talks about this bright, sunny Christianity, where it's a party all the time, and I think just an important thing was just making room for the fullness of human experience, encounter, emotion, being able to ask questions, to even rail your fist at God in some ways, and that being okay, not gonna break faith or something like that. There's an act of faith, and I think that just opened up space that I didn't know that I needed, but it was kind of a lifeline, if you will. And it's not that far between that moment and when I enter business school, and sort of it just all, like 2 years later, it's all coming back together in a way that I didn't know it could be woven.
What's your greatest wish?
My greatest wish. I think that my greatest wish is that if we can actually encounter one another in the fullness of ourselves, there might actually be healing that that we desperately long for. And so how do we make that journey ourselves so that we can be present to that experience and healing, to use a word that you were offering earlier? Yeah, and I think that if we actually know and love and experience one another, in that way, it will be transformative, healing.
I'm Maria Swearingen, and I live in Washington, D.C.
Wonderful.
So I grew up in a tiny town in southeast Texas along the Louisiana border, Woodville, Texas. It's a couple hours north of Houston. But a lot of times when I say that, people assume, especially with how sprawling Houston is, that I grew up in the suburbs of Houston, and I did not grow up in the suburbs. Grew up in a very, very small town. From there, I went to college, did undergraduate at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. So I was there for a number of years. Graduate school in Durham, North Carolina at Duke Divinity School, and then spent a number of years in Greenville, South Carolina, where while I was at Duke, I had met my now wife, Sally, and then moved to DC a couple of years ago.
One of the things she told me in her interview that so affected her was when you told her she had a pastor's heart.
She did. She had a pastor's heart. Yeah, I could sense that pretty quickly. So, and I think, we all are, even as we're making sense of ourselves, I was sort of making sense of my own pastor's heart, and I think probably always kind of wanting to find that in others as well, and did really quickly in her, also while I was falling in love with her, so, which was fun.
Sometimes I do find it helpful to hear about people's concept of God or higher power, and I just would love to hear yours.
Yeah, I think, the joke that I make, others get to decide how funny it is or not, but the joke that I make is that I came into the world one kind of Baptist, and I came out quite literally another kind of Baptist. So in the process with making sense of and sort of accepting and claiming my own sexual orientation and identity, a lot of my own sort of conception of God and understanding of God, I don't like to say it certainly changed, but I think more than anything it expanded. Sort of my conception of the presence and the conception of love, of God's love for us, for humanity, for creation, for the world, just sort of continued to expand. But all that to say, a lot of kind of where I am theologically at this point is pretty deeply rooted in a kind of particular strand of the story of Christian theology called liberation theology, which really kind of began with Black liberation theology in the United States, which was, Black folks in the U.S., particularly in the 60s and 70s, making sense of kind of this profound theological question and a political question too, right? Like how am I supposed to claim a God like this if this is the God that the people who've oppressed my people for hundreds of years now claim? How do I claim a God that, from my vantage point in the world, is oppressive and violent and completely unconcerned with my dignity and well-being, right? So this sort of profound question comes from this, I guess you could call it school of thought, but really I call it like divine imagination. And I think for me, making sense of my identity and presence in the world as a queer person, that really resonated with me. And also with my own racial identity as sort of understood in the world as white, but being bi-ethnic, being half Hispanic, there were sort of all these layers that began to unfold for me in my 20s about making sense of colonialism in America and in the world, the colonial wound. And as someone who's half Puerto Rican, and Puerto Rico's story with the United States and with identity and race, there's just sort of all these layers that were sort of coming to a head that I was making sense of while making sense of, but also how I loved and lived in the world. And so all of this, produced a great, lots of tension and uncertainty, but I think it also kind of freed me to imagine the work of theology in the world differently. And like I said, really sort of expanded my understanding of God. So the kind of classical way people understand or often talk about liberation theology is that that God is on the side of the oppressed. God is on the side of those who are suffering. And a lot of times the critique of liberation theology is like, well, wait a minute, how could God be on anyone's side? Isn't God on everyone's side? God loves us all and all of humanity, so how could God be on anyone's side? And, I certainly get the critique. I think it's a faulty one. And part of the reason why is that I think it kind of misses the heart of the case that liberation theology is making, which is also that God is on everyone's side too. But when we choose not to be on the side of humanity, right? When there are those among us who, for want of power and greed and security and the list of things, right, that we seek after, matters more to us than the well-being of those among us and around us, then we are saying we're not on God's side. It's not that God isn't on our side. It's that God's saying, I'm on the side of those struggling to exist in this world with dignity, and you're actually choosing not to be on that side. So there's sort of some irony in it, and I think kind of falsely produced sides that aren't really there. I think the real heart of what liberation theology is speaking into the world is that God, in creating us and loving us, is deeply concerned with our well-being. And for those for whom structures in the world are harming their well-being and dignity, God is saying back to us, what will we do together and who will we be in response to that? So, all that to say, it became for me a real space of freedom and joy and life, and kind of reigniting and reimagining what faith could be, and how it could both give me being language, it could give me doing language, gave me exciting and freeing language for God and also for myself.
What's your earliest memory of having faith?
Yeah, earliest memory of having faith. Probably, I'm trying to think if there's an earlier one from the story I'm thinking of telling. I'll tell this one. There might be an earlier one, but so I was baptized in the Christian tradition as an evangelical Baptist when I was 6, so very, very young. And it was actually, old school tent revival. So like it's in the summer, Texas heat, outdoor, tent pegs, tent up, traveling evangelist, tent revival. And the proclaimer that night told this story about a brother and sister who had been in a car accident and they died. And he said in his story that one of them, I think maybe the sister, had given her life to Christ the night before and the brother had not. And so then he looked back at everyone and said, so you tell me which one is in heaven and which one is in hell today. And of course I'm 6 and terrified. And my dad is also when I was a kid, was an evangelical pastor, Baptist pastor, and he was also kind of there at the revival, helping coordinate or whatever. So at the end, where people can come down to the aisle and confess, make their profession of faith, he was one of the pastors that would take the folks running down the aisle. And I was just, covered in tears. And I ran down, the aisle of this tent and just started yelling like, "Daddy, I don't want to go to hell." And so he picked me up and, I very much remember him sort of holding me closely. And so that then went into, a couple of weeks of us talking about, what it meant to be Christian and what it meant for Jesus to save us from our sins and what it meant to make a personal profession of faith. And so a couple weeks later, my dad baptized me. And so, that story is, of course, like at this point in my journey, it's a really, I would point back to it and see it as really distressing, right? Like that is I don't want any children at our church experiencing faith that way. I feel pretty clear about naming that. But, emotionally, what's so interesting to me is the way in which there was this kind of juxtaposition of terror and comfort sort of all at once. Just this sheer terror over death and my own mortality and failing. And, I'm 6. I don't even know how to make sense of this at 6. But then also this kind of guttural cry that I just wanted to be okay. And at least at that point in my life, having someone who could provide that sort of immediate comfort. And I remember those conversations with my dad to be really kind of tender ones, sort of after that moment, like talking about faith. And so the kind of odd thing about it all is I think all of that demonstrated to me that I was really curious about theology and really curious about talking about faith and about life and death and the things that sort of matter to us. And I found like sort of great joy in that aspect of it. But also there was this layer of the kind of violence of the theology that took me, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but sort of took me, a number of years to let go of and reinterpret and reconstruct and make sense of. So.
What do you feel was the first time in your life you had to or chose to rely upon God as you understand God?
One certainly significant moment was, probably the most significant, was in the process of coming out to family, coming out to myself, making sense of how that shaped identity and future and vocation and calling. And I was in seminary at the time. And so I was relying on a God that I hoped would be up for it, and also sort of relying on a God I hadn't met before yet, right? Like there was a new and brewing conception of God being formed while I was also relying on that God. So it was a strange and wondrous time. I have this memory as, I guess I was a sophomore in high school, so 14, 15, something like that. And my abuelo, my grandfather in Puerto Rico, had a really serious surgery. And so we traveled to Puerto Rico to be there for the surgery, and it went well. And we had gone to church the Sunday before the surgery. I think he had the surgery like on a Monday. And we'd gone to this church, and the pastor said something about like, tu milagro va a ser con el número 12. Like your miracle this week is going to be with the number 12. And it was sort of left at that. So I remember the day of my grandfather's surgery, I kept looking at my watch, just sort of begging God that his surgery would be at noon, you know. And sure enough, like the doctor comes in and says, we're rolling him in. We've started the surgery. And I looked at my clock, looked at my watch and at the clock, and it was noon. And I remember sort of thinking like, okay, I'm fully relying on God right now in this moment. And, God's answering my prayer, and like my grandfather's going to be great. He did well through the surgery. And then a week later, he had severe complications from the surgery, and he died. And I remember we had already traveled back from Puerto Rico to my home, to Woodville. And so we were at the house when we got the call, and I remember I was just crashing to the floor. I was the kitchen floor. And I just laid there for like 2 hours just weeping. And of course I was grieving this death and loss, but it was also this sort of sense of, again, in my like conception of who God was and how God worked, and, praying for rewards and not wanting punishment, right? This God of rewards and punishment, like something was crashing and burning in this moment for me, right? That I thought God had said yes, and now God wasn't saying yes anymore. And I it's almost like you can feel a bone snap. Like I can remember feeling something in my soul snap that night, that was important, again, to keep expanding my sort of conception of a life of faith. And so that was sort of a story of both, like this reliance on God, but also a reimagining of what reliance on God looks like. So I have this memory of probably my second year of seminary. I had a night class, and after that class, on the way to the parking garage, I'd basically just walk right by Duke Chapel. And so sometimes at the end of the night, I would go in and just sort of check it out and kind of sit among the stained glass and sort of take it all in, moment for reflection. And that particular night, I was just really struggling, with questions of identity, my own reckoning with sexual orientation and identity, how that sat in relationship to faith and family, making sense of vocation. At that point, I, felt called to ministry, and sort of all these things I, was sort of really struggling with. And I was sitting in one of the front pews, kind of farther down in the chapel. And I remember just kind of sort of looking up or out and saying something along the lines of, God, if you really want someone like me, to be in ministry, I'm really struggling to put all this together, and I feel like I need a sign, something like that. So, as cheesy as it sounds, I, pulled the Bible from the pew rack, and I just, flipped it open as to see what would happen. And I flipped it to a verse in one of the Psalms that reads, "And you shall be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." And I remember just bursting out in a laugh. I mean, I'm crying, but also just laughing, like, who the hell is Melchizedek? Like, what? So like, you shall be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. I'm like, okay, well, great. But I did a little bit sort of exploring, and Melchizedek is this kind of enigmatic, unknown character in Genesis who When Abraham and Sarah need a blessing, he just out of nowhere sort of pops up with bread. He's often kind of treated as a symbolic priest of this kind of Old Testament imagery for communion within the Christian tradition. He gives bread and blesses them, and then kind of goes on, about his way. So the fascinating thing for me about this Melchizedek was he didn't come from like a line, right? He wasn't a Levite, or he wasn't from the lineage of the tradition of priests. We honestly don't even know if he believed in the Hebrew God. Like, he just kind of comes out of nowhere. We don't really know what he's up to. They ask for blessing, he gives it. And so for me, it became this reimagining, right? That maybe I don't sit inside a tradition that I even know or know how to make sense of. I don't know kind of what my lineage will be as like a queer Baptist pastor. But it became this blessing for me. Like, it doesn't matter. The point is, there's someone in this story who shows up and they call him a priest and he has bread, and that's that. And maybe that's enough. And so that became this kind of unexpected way for me to begin to configure and reconfigure my own interpretation of like my calling in the world.
And was there a spiritual or religious component to your coming out?
Yeah. Sometimes I joke that everyone should have to come out as something, just to see what happens to the soul, just to kind of joggle things up. It was a deeply spiritual process to face myself, to face kind of that wall of uncertainty of others, like, where will this go? Where will this not go? What will be lost? I have, deep and profound experiences of all of it, of great loss, of great gain, of great joy, of great heartache. And I think all of that in its own way is fortifying for the soul. Therapy was very important. Really having good, tended space to process it all. Yeah, no, coming out is no joke. And I think that's the case for even for people who have, who maybe didn't kind of grow up with, just to use a term that I think is common to most, like religious baggage, for folks for whom that's not their story. I still think it's hard.
Coming out.
Yeah. I do have a friend, and I don't know if Sally told this story or not, but sort of friend and colleague who has a friend and colleague who taught him this phrase, and he taught us, that a really helpful kind of reframe for coming out is to imagine it as inviting in instead of coming out. Because it changes sort of the locus of gravity and power, right? That if you're coming out, you're constantly, it's just this never-ending revolving door of anxiety, right? Like, and I'm going to come out now, and I'm going to come out now, and I hope it goes well, and I don't know if it will. Versus inviting in is saying, like, this is my life, and this is the force field of my life, right? And I'm telling you that I trust you enough to welcome you into it. And that was a pretty cataclysmic moment for me, that shift of language, to understand it. It still is coming out. There's still vulnerability and anxiety, but like shifting it to recentering myself as sort of the locus and saying, like, actually, I'm inviting you in, and you may accept or reject that invitation. Please keep me posted, RSVP. But this is your invitation to my life.
What are you most grateful for?
Really, I mean, the capacity to love is just the most bizarre and wondrous mystery. It can be reaching, but wow, is it incredible when we sort of find that centered place that we can love from and be loved by. So I do, just that I can remind myself on a frequent basis, I can love all the time. I can love the whole, like I have the capacity to be a participant in giving life to people, that's, it's pretty mind-boggling when we take long enough to reflect on it. I see that expressed in life and marriage with Sally, in just deep and abiding and consistent and unexpected ways over and over again. But I often, if I'm counseling a couple who's thinking about marriage or going to be married, I talk about what it means to try to choose or build life with someone who helps you fall in love with the world, that like there's a way in which what we hope, any intimate relationship, whether it's marriage or a good friendship or whatever it may be, that what that is doing is giving you kind of the ground and network and the synapses so that you're like capable to just keep loving beyond that thing. So I'm grateful for the relationships that really help me do that.